Player switching, an absolute staple in your defensive game and super crucial for maintaining a solid defense. This is my complete guide to player switching in FIFA 22.
Griezmann, 3 men around him to somehow find some space. Ronaldo, fantastic, opening the drive back.
He's made himself the tiniest bit of space.
Almost feels like a bit of a taunt. Didn't really go for him. Oh! The display there is absolutely ridiculous. The Elastico on the goal line. On the goal line, the finest.
We
of
talked about
margins.
Aussie FIFA. He's not here to make up the numbers.
First up, the basics of player switching. There's around 3 different methods of player switching in FIFA 22. The first is of course the L1 or LB player switching technique, which is just by tapping the L1 or LB button to then select the player which is closest to the original player that you already have control of. Now there will be a very fainted arrow above the second player in your defense, and that is the indicator as to which player will be selected next. Usually the player that has the fainted arrow will be the second closest player to the attacker with the ball. Secondly, we have right stick switching. Absolutely crucial in FIFA 22, and the way you do it is by flicking that right stick into the direction of the player that you're wanting to select. Now in terms of the settings, I highly recommend you guys selecting player relative with player switching, not ball relative. Ball relative entails you selecting a player with the right stick from where the ball is, whereas player relative is you selecting a defensive player from the player that you already have control of, because I find player relative is a lot easier to select a player without thinking about it too much with the right stick. Icon switching, a new addition to FIFA 22, and the way you perform this is by pressing down the R3 button. And what will happen is there will be a selection of players with icons above their heads, and it will have 4 options including up, right, left or back, and that will determine as to which player you will select depending on which icon they have above their head. Do I recommend utilizing this technique? Absolutely not. I find right stick switching is a lot better this year. You don't have to think about it as much, and with icon switching I find you have to think about it, and it's just too much to take into account, especially when you're trying to defend and keep a solid defense. The less you have to think about in FIFA 22, the better. This second segment is what not to do when player switching in FIFA 22. There's one key tip that I want to stress in this segment is don't abuse L1 or LB switching. The reason being is because with L1 or LB switching, it will select the defender who the AI thinks you want to select. And a lot of the time, this won't always be the defender who you want to control. So if you continuously spam L1 or LB switching, you may select a defender which won't be the best selection for you to make that defensive tackle, or in general, keep a tight defense. That is why I stress to you guys, you should definitely utilize right stick selection more often than any other technique. Utilizing the map to look who you have selected. Very, very important for selecting the right defender in FIFA 22, and a very good way of ensuring that if you have selected the wrong player, you can then reselect the player with the right stick by using the map to indicate where you should flick that stick. And that's what I highly recommend also. If you guys are struggling to right stick select in general when you're practicing this technique, then utilize the map, look down at where your players are positioned on the map, and practice selecting the defender that you want utilizing that right stick. And obviously we have it on player relative, so in that case you will just need to look of who you already have selected and then aim the right stick towards the player from the player you have selected to select the correct player. The map is a very, very good way of looking who you have selected and then readjusting if need be. Utilizing L1 switching to select the player who is second man pressing. L1 switching is a very, very useful technique, especially in these situations where you are controlling a second defender and you are utilizing second man press. And the way second man press works is you hold down R1 or RB, and what will happen is that the player who is closest to the defender who you aren't in control of will then start to press the attacker. What I find is you can cut the passing lanes with the player who you have control of, and then as you get close with the second man press player, you can then tap L1 or LB to select that player to then make that tackle. This is a super useful way of utilizing L1 and LB switching this year. Utilizing right stick selection to put pressure onto your opponent. This is something that I utilize a lot, especially to manually press my opponent without having to rely on the AI to do so in my custom tactics. The way you do this is you want to continuously switch to defenders as you are putting pressure onto your opponent, and this will entail utilizing your attackers to put pressure onto your opponent, your midfielders, and then obviously your defense if your opponent gets that far into your defensive half. What I like to do personally is continuously switch, put pressure onto my opponent, utilize second man press where I need to, and eventually suffocating my opponent so that he has nowhere to go in terms of his attack. Now, one key tip I do want to mention here though is you shouldn't bring players out of their position. When you're doing this technique, be sure to keep the defender in his position so that you don't open up gaps in the defense. Utilizing right stick switching to read your opponent's goal kicks, goalkeeper throws, or switch of play. Right stick switching is very useful in these situations, especially when you want to quickly select either the right wing or left wing to run and intercept the ball from your opponent's goalkeeper throw, goal kick, or switch of play. Obviously this entails you guys reading your opponent, but more likely than not, a lot of players this year in FIFA 22 will look for their wing bats, and this allows us to have a 50-50 chance of putting pressure onto our opponent and right stick selecting one of our wingers to then intercept that ball. In these situations specifically, you can see me utilizing that right stick, select the wingers to then run up, intercept the ball, and have one-on-one situation with the goalkeeper. And again, with switch of play, it's easy to read. Obviously your opponent is wanting to switch the play to take the ball away from the pressure, and what you can do is right stick select opposite winger to run and put pressure onto that wing back who he is passing it to. Utilizing right stick switching to read your opponent on the wing. A very common play in FIFA in general is the ball from the wing back up to the winger. It's a very good way of intercepting this, and that's of course right stick switching. If you want to intercept this and you read this play, what you can do is right stick select the wing back, then before the player has even pass the ball, run in front of that winger, or at least put pressure onto that winger so that you can try and win that ball back. This is a very good way of winning the ball back in FIFA 22, and if you guys can at least read your opponent before he even makes that pass, then in general you're going to prevail in your defensive game. Utilizing right stick switching to pounce on your opponent. I did go into this in my pouncing on the attacker tutorial. If you haven't seen that, go and check it out. A very good defensive technique in FIFA 22. However, you can utilize right stick switching to essentially select a defender and then instantaneously pouncing on the opponent as he takes a large touch. Now usually a large touch will be taken after your opponent begins to sprint, and right stick switching is a very good way of making a tackle on these large touches because you can select the defender, utilize R2 and L2 to activate the speed jockey motion, and then pounce on the opponent as he takes that large touch to get that tackle in. Utilizing right stick switching between your centre backs. A very good way of preventing counter attacks, specifically up the centre of the pitch. If your opponent is doing quick tiki-taka passing up the pitch in a counter attacking fashion, then utilizing this technique of switching between your centre backs to mark the runs and then obviously try and get those tackles in is a very good way of defending in FIFA 22. Obviously you need to be careful of not drawing the centre back out in these situations. However, if you guys can continuously run back with your centre backs, switch in between both of them to obviously select the centre back, mark the runners, and then tackle that ball is a very good way of preventing counter attacks and obviously utilising right stick switching with your centre backs. Utilizing right stick switching to mark the runner. Very, very important defending technique in FIFA 22. This will prevent you conceding counter attacks and conceding through balls, because if you don't mark that runner, you will be vulnerable in behind. In these situations where you see an attacker making a run, it is important that you guys select the defender who is closest to him so that you can mark him to prevent that through ball being made. Utilising right stick switching for last ditch tackles. You might be in a situation where you are now vulnerable in the defence and the last option you have is making a block from your opponent's shot. Very good way of preventing this from happening is of course selecting that centre back just before he makes that shot to get in front and obviously make that block. This of course is by utilising right stick to select that correct centre back and obviously try and get that last ditch tackle in. My final tip for you guys in this complete guide to player switching is if you are having trouble right stick switching, I highly recommend you guys going into skill games or into kickoff, selecting the difficulty to beginner and then continuously switching between players to practice right stick switching so that you can get it down pat. I know for me back in the day it took me a long time to get used to, but lads, it's a crucial way of defending and switching to players in FIFA 22 and you guys should definitely utilize it in your FIFA 22 defending game. But that will signal the end of the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Can we smash a like, drop a subscribe, and follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I'm doing tutorials over there, lads. So go and check me out over there. And I will say good day to you guys. But as always, I hope you have a good day. I'm out. Sayonara, au revoir, adios, salam, and goodbye.